Hi everybody. In this video demo, I will create a limited user in Kubernetes cluster. This user will not have all permissions as the default user kubeadmin. And this user will only have some permissions allowed to create or delete resources. Let's create a key and certificate request for this user. The subject name must match the name of the user we are gonna create inside Kubernetes cluster. Now let's create a certificate request, certificate sign request object, and we should extract the certificate sign request from the file we have just created and encode in base 64. Let's approve the certificate sign request and then extract the certificate info from the certificate sign request object and save in a new file. This file will work as the user certificate. Let's create a role for this user. Let's call it developer and mention the actions allowed to do by this user. We can also specify the resources this user can do these actions for. Let's bind these permissions or this role with a user using what's so-called role binding. I will create role binding to bind this role to the same user we have created. So far we have created a user, a certificate, and a key. But we should tell Kubernetes cluster that we have a user called Ahmed, and we should bind this user with the client key and client certificate to allow this user get connected to Kubernetes cluster. We should create a context for this user where this user is bound to a specific cluster in our config file. So we are gonna create a context that binds cluster Kubernetes to the user Ahmed. Let's assert user actions. I will have first to switch to developer context. And let's try some user actions. For example, create, update, or delete a pod. We can also assert the user actions without having to actually create the object or the resource itself. For example, we can assert if the user is allowed to create or delete a service or a pod. We can also assert if the user can create a deployment. And we can also impersonate this user or test if another user is allowed to do some actions, some specific actions to a specific resource or object. Switch back to the main default context and try some actions with some resources impersonating the user we have just created. Let's try to delete a pod using another user and see if this action will be allowed. Of course, it will not work because user does not have delete permission for the resource pod.